la monnaie pour la zone Afrique de l'Ouest.
The currency for the West African region, and I'm asking our authorities. We have two presidents of the Republic here in the room. We need to move forward on these issues, which have been resolved everywhere else in the world, sometimes as a priority, if not most of the time.
Combien de pays ont une zone monétaire?
How many countries have a common monetary zone? It's very few. The example we have is West and Central Africa. Yet other countries are coping more or less. We know the problems. We know the reforms that need to be made. They've been on the table for years, but there's a lack of political courage, and it's time our authorities took responsibility for carrying out the reforms. Otherwise, the people will do them for them.
Pour faire les réformes, autrement les peuples le feront à leur place. La principale préoccupation qui a été exprimée ici tourne autour d'une notion.
The main concern expressed here revolves around a notion increasingly dear to all Africans, that of sovereignty, which is not, in reality, exclusive. It shouldn't be understood that way.
Nous sommes dans un forum pour attirer des investisseurs, les inciter à s'intéresser à l'Afrique.
Today we are in a forum to attract investors, to encourage them to take an interest in Africa in general, in Senegal, which was once the exit point, as my counterpart said, and the entry point, we hope.
Nous n'avons jamais conçu le Sénégal comme un îlot.
And in our conception, we have never seen Senegal as an island. In any case, when we talk about Senegal and everywhere we go, we talk about Senegal as a platform within an integrated sub-regional and African framework. Since we are increasingly talking about it independently of political processes, and that is why I am delighted with the presence here of my counterparts from Burkina Faso and Niger. That is the political process. But we have linked goals, and whatever the outcome, a confederation of the AES, we will continue bilaterally and, as within the framework, within a broader framework, to work as if nothing had happened with our brothers in other countries.
Et nous concevons le Sénégal comme
And we maintain Senegal as a continuum for all of Africa, and for West Africa in particular.
pour l'Afrique de l'Ouest en particulier. Et c'est pourquoi
And this is why we want to reassure investors. The sovereignist debate that arises in Africa stems from a long history that we experience in varying ways depending on our
nous
partners.
vivrons de manière variée selon les partenaires.
But today, Africans are more aware that, as I said earlier, the same methods that have produced results everywhere else must be applied in Africa. We are not reinventing the
Nous ne
wheel.
sommes pas en train de réinventer le roue.
And on this point, I think that governance must first refocus on our own endogenous capacities.
Se recentrer sur nos propres capacités endogènes. Pourquoi au Sénégal, quand on a
This is why in Senegal, when we made the observation that was made after the social reforms, that have an endogenous plan of more than 90% through non-suffocating tax reforms,
qui ne crée pas de surcharge fiscale, mais qui vont chercher
that do not create a tax burden, but which seek out tax loopholes that allow us today to validly project almost 6 trillion over 3 years of additional revenue.
recettes additionnelles, mais qui seront orientées
But which will be directed in complementarity with what we can do with the private sector towards productive
des
investments,
investissements productifs vers la relance des grands chantiers chers
towards the revival of major projects dear to the President of the Republic for this term will be extremely important. Then, we talked a lot about resources. Indeed, Africa is truly well endowed with them, but so far, it has not produced much. And this resource is important.
Et ces ressources-là, il est important. Est-il admissible que le Sénégal et son voisin, la Mauritanie,
Is it unacceptable that Senegal and its neighbor Mauritania are discovering gas, and that this gas is not benefiting our industrial transformation before anything else? This is not normal. And if we find ourselves in this situation, we must take responsibility to correct what needs to be done, what must be done.
Et c'est pourquoi aujourd'hui, je veux rassurer aussi les investisseurs.
And that's extremely important. And that's why today, I also want to reassure investors that we want a much more balanced, win-win partnership. The approach has been tried and tested so far. When you look at the case of Senegal, since we discovered, with the said government, a significant portion of debt that has not been disclosed. The internal debate, unfortunately fueled by media propaganda, is as if Senegal's fate depends on the outside world, particularly the International Monetary Fund, which is not the case. In reality, this partnership is extremely important, but Senegal's fate will depend first and foremost on the Senegalese people themselves.
À faire le sursaut qu'il faut à travers ce plan de redressement économique et social.
Making the necessary leap forward through this economic and social recovery plan as a priority first will depend on that. It will depend on the fiscal consolidation efforts we make, and which will give us credibility with our partners.
D'un certain nombre de facteurs, notamment intégrer ce qui doit l'être en termes budgétaires pour avoir la réalité qu'il faut. Et ça dépendra en définitive.
It will certainly depend on the re-examination of a number of factors, notably, to a degree, what must be done in budgetary terms to see the reality that is required. And it will ultimately depend, in the last resort, on what agreement we can reach with institutions like the IMF, a prior which does not solve our problem. A $1.8 billion agreement with the IMF will not solve Senegal's fiscal problems. But it may be a guarantee that will allow us to move towards the market in much more serene conditions and also reassure investors. And I would also like to take this opportunity to say that, as Africans, we are fervent defenders of multilateralism. But there are entire sections of multilateralism that will need to be reviewed today, even for the major powers. The ability to collaborate with a country will depend much more on the approval of a certain number of institutions, even though, on the bilateral level, you will realize that the conditions are right for cooperating with these countries.
Et ça va déteindre aussi sur la notation. Je pense qu'aujourd'hui,
but we'll say we're waiting for the IMF's opinion. We're waiting. And that will also affect the rating. I think that today, a very in-depth reflection must be initiated on this issue. But what I would like to say, ultimately, is that African countries must rely on themselves first. And that's what will reassure partners who will come much more readily to this end. The question of financing our economies, the question of capital arises, but the plan, we don't have a single plan. The way the West, for example, through Europe and its outgrowth towards America, the way it was done based on exploitation, it must be said, the slave trade, colonization, which served to fuel the Industrial Revolution and its takeoff, is not the same model as Asia, which perhaps did not work on the same basis. But today, you go to China.
La traite, la colonisation qui ont servi à alimenter la révolution industrielle et le décollage n'est pas.
That's much more based on opening up to foreign direct investment, cleaning up public management, and so on. And we must choose our model, create our own model. And this model, in my opinion, will be achieved through good management of our resources, good reappropriation of our natural resources, flawless budgetary discipline.
Par nous-mêmes, et ce modèle-là, à mon avis, se fera par une bonne gestion de nos ressources, une bonne réappropriation de nos ressources naturelles, une discipline budgétaire sans faille, un train de vie qui correspond à nos capacités.
A lifestyle that matches our capabilities, and now prioritize partnership, foreign direct investment over debt, a certain form of debt, reaching out to our international partners by telling them the framework is sound and it is incentivizing. Come invest in a win-win partnership. We're not reaching out, we don't want donations. What we want is for us, together, to co-build development that is mutually beneficial, not a system like the one we've experienced so far, which consists of siphoning off resources from Africa and repatriating them elsewhere.
Et non un système tel que nous l'avons vécu jusqu'à présent, qui consiste à venir pomper les ressources en Afrique, les rapatrier ailleurs. Comme je disais dans une de mes publications, les ressources.
As I said in one of my publications, there is a free flow of resources, but we reject the free flow of people. And that's what has perhaps led us to be associated with them. But that doesn't absolve us of our responsibilities, of the responsibility of our authorities. We need political courage in decision-making. Let's take a very simple example, the currency for the West African region. And I ask our authorities, we have two presidents of the Republic here in the room. We need to move forward on these issues, which have been resolved everywhere else in the world.
Il faut avancer sur ces questions-là qui ont été résolues partout ailleurs dans le monde, quelquefois de manière unitaire, pour ne pas dire la plupart du temps.
sometimes as a priority, if not most of the time. How many countries have a common monetary zone? It's very few. The example we have is practically West Africa and Central Africa. However, other countries are more or less coping. We know the problems, we know the reforms that need to be made. For years, they've been on the table, but there's a lack of political courage, and it's time for our authorities to take responsibility for making the reforms. Otherwise, the people will do them for them.